Hey, I'm Sarah Smith, family doctor, clinical day advisor, and the chatting coach. Welcome back to Sustainable Clinical Medicine podcast, where we're going to be interviewing peers or world experts who can help us think about our clinical day in a way that is more sustainable and create time for our lives outside of medicine. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode. Today we have with us Dr. Andrea Austin. I'm super excited to have you here. Welcome.
Hi, Sarah. It's so great to be here.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Tell us about you and the things you do.
So, I'm an emergency medicine physician and educator. My new role is as a program director for a residency program that's starting here in Pensacola, Florida. So, very exciting building a program, trying to make my own secret sauce of all the great things I've learned about doctoring and education. I love to write. I wrote a book, I have a podcast, and I coach. And that gets at most of it.
Perfect. Tell us your journey through medicine. Did you always want to do emergency medicine? Were you always in emergency medicine?
Oh, I love this question. My first interest in medicine came in sixth grade. There was something called Take Our Daughters to Work Day. And at a young age, I thought outside the box. I knew what my mom and dad did, and I really didn't want to go to work with them. So I said, can I actually go with the PA, the physician associate in my hometown, Lori? And the teacher was like, sure, that's fine. You can go with her if she'll have you. So I followed around my PA in my hometown, and I just was mesmerized by the science and the detective work and listening to people's stories. I just found it incredibly fascinating. And Lori was a PA, and she was a great early mentor. And I asked her about, should I go to PA or medical school? And she and also the nurse that worked for her said, you should be a doctor. You've decided this early enough in your career, your life, that go to medical school. And so that really stuck with me.
Wow, that's so interesting. Now
Yeah.
tell us about the journey in medicine. How did that transpire?
Yes. So pretty, I guess, typical. I was a biology major in undergrad, got into medical school. I would like to highlight I only got into one medical school. And I think that's a really important story for people. I think a lot of times we're comparing ourselves to others throughout the journey. It was kind of by the skin of my teeth that I got into medical school. But once I was there, I did really well, and I flourished, and I just loved it. And then I had a pretty good sense that I was probably going to be an emergency doctor. I tried to keep an open mind, and I really thought for a while in my third year that I was going to do general surgery. I had a really fantastic general surgery rotation. I loved the surgeons that I worked with. I would say that I had, maybe a bit atypical, because not everyone says that about their surgical rotation, but I had just a great group of educators. And at the last minute, I flipped to emergency medicine. And it's, honestly, it's been kind of an up and down. I would say that it kind of, I wouldn't say love hate, but a love and like some difficult times along the way. Being an emergency doctor during COVID was really hard. And, I've questioned my specialty choice. And through coaching, therapy, mentoring, all the things, I've come around to the other side. And not only do I love being an emergency doctor, I'm starting a residency program.
Yeah, that takes somebody who's enjoying their field to want to go and say, hey, you should come do this too. I can imagine that if you're a program director that is burnt out and not enjoying their career, that's probably not the right person to be running the new residency program.
Yeah, not exactly what you'd put on the recruitment uh, brochure.
So you mentioned therapy, coaching. What was happening for you at the time that was this in the middle of COVID? Was this after COVID? When were you starting to really look at looking after yourself and healing from what you'd experienced?
Yeah, I would say there were several moments, when I came back from deployment, which isn't an uncommon experience. So I was in the Navy, I went to Iraq, and, there were things about that deployment that were really amazing and rewarding. And I loved the work that I did, and I'm proud of the work that I did. But there were just things that kind of left an emotional wound. So I
Mm.
came back from deployment and I just felt angry a lot of the time. And thankfully, I had enough people around me that had deployed before, and they were like, it's not uncommon to have these feelings. And so that was my first foray into going to therapy and talking through that. And I thought it was really helpful. And then, COVID is kind of like the hold my beer moment. I think all of us struggled. Everyone had their personal stories during COVID. And so it was just a really scary time to be an emergency doctor. I was working in Los Angeles very early on in the pandemic. I remember a shift where almost surely somebody had COVID, and I had to fight to have a mask. I literally had to like tell the charge nurse that I wasn't going to go into the room unless she gave me one of the masks. She only had 10 to give out during that shift. And so that was just a real, I guess what I would describe a lot of the feelings during COVID, institutional betrayal, feeling like the system had abandoned us and left us. I still remember like the CDC guidance that, consider wearing a scarf. And I'm like, really? Like wear a scarf to work? Um, I just felt very abandoned
Mm.
during that time. And I didn't really know how to harness my agency. I think is the best description. Looking back on it, there was a lot of learned helplessness. I just didn't know how I could channel practicing medicine in line with my values and making a positive impact.
Wow. That sounds terrifying. I was in
Yeah.
Canada at the time and we were not having the same level of institutional abandonment that you are describing. And so that's yeah, heartbreaking to hear even just that little teeny tiny segment of it is impactful. Okay, so on the back end of that is we hear within our trauma-informed lens that in the battlefield is not necessarily when you fall apart, it's kind of the aftermath. When things are starting to improve, that's when people are like puddles of what the heck just happened to me?
Yeah, that's such a great analogy that it was after the vaccine came out that I had the vaccine that I actually went on vacation. And I'm going to tell you this story, and I feel like a really bad person. I had my vaccine, but my husband did not have his. And I looked at him and I'm like, if I don't go on vacation, I don't really know what I'm going to do. So we chose a vacation that we'd be primarily outside. But I was very concerned that he was going to contract COVID on that vacation. But I was like, if we're going to go together, I got to go. So we did. We went on vacation. And during that week, I just had like, it was like the first time I exhaled, it was like the first time I had fun and did like normal things. And that's where my brain started to be like, I gotta go. I gotta do something else. Like the place that I'm at right now, this job is not working for me. And so it's during that trip that I began to reformulate what I was going to do.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So you kind of get a breath, you exhale, and then you're like, no, this is not safe for me.
Yeah. So what I did next is I found a remote online teaching job. So one of the things that I do is I'm a simulation educator.
Mhm.
Simulation's been a big part of my career, and so I was very fortunate that a colleague from my time in the military forwarded me a job, and it was almost written exactly for me. I had just enough number of years of experience, and I just kind of like hit the check mark. And so I sent in my application, and I got the job, and it provided like the best way I can say was like a life preserver. Is
Mm.
it gave me it was a part-time position and a lot less money than I was making, but it was enough money over the summer for me to breathe and regulate my sleep. And
Mhm.
another thing, like looking back on that time during COVID, when I took that different job, it was my first job out of the military. I accepted working more nights. And in retrospect, that was a terrible idea. And all of us know how hard night shifts are. And to put that extra physiologic strain on myself during, a time that was just so draining for all of us was not good. And so that summer I taught during the day and I slept and I went to therapy and did coaching and just really recovered. And it took me about 3 months for just my body to start to feel human again.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. That sounds amazing. To have had that time to step out and away from the things that were hurting you and to really do some deep work on looking after you. Love it. Okay. So what
Yeah.
happened after that? After
So
those 3 months?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. I left the military in 2020 and the joke is I lasted a whole, less than a year and I was back in the military system again. Is I had this part-time job working for the military and what it afforded me is I was able to go back and do my master's in health professions education for free because if you were a federal employee or active duty military, I could enter this program. So I had started my master's while I was active duty and I left. And so then I thought I wasn't going to be able to finish my degree, but then the door opened again. And so I dived into this master's of health professions education. And it was just the most transformative, pivotal, awesome career thing that I could have ever done. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be where I am today.
Mhm.
And my thesis is on change making in healthcare and how do we create curricula and create the conditions in which more of us can create a positive change in healthcare. And, you know, the paper I ended up writing and that got published is I feel like it's my symphony. I hope I live a really, really long time and write many more papers like that. But I can rest like at night knowing that this paper is out in the world. And I'm really excited to talk to you about it. And because I think it has the keys to really unlocking more of us creating positive change because we all know healthcare needs to change.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us more.
Yeah, so this was a study of 15 physicians that we had a set of criteria to define them as change maker. And I want to first unpack the term change maker because it's probably one your audience hasn't heard. If you read any of the change literature, and some people out there will probably know Cotter's 8 Steps of Change. So they use the term change agent. And the joke I like to make about healthcare is there are a lot of change agents walking around. They're making change. Not all of us are really happy with the change that's happening. And a change maker, the term actually comes from the nonprofit world. And that term means a change agent that's making positive change for society. And it also adds in that this person is using creativity and has tenacity to make change. So when I read that word, I was like, that's the definition of what we need more of in healthcare. So we interviewed 15 physicians and asked about their life stories, their careers, the types of places that they were working in, and did a qualitative analysis to see what were the individual factors that helped them be effective change makers. And then what were the set of conditions in the organizations that supported them? Because you can run a thought experiment of like, if you have this person that's like the most, they're the Buddha of change making, but you put them in an incredible dysfunctional environment, they're not going to be able to make change. So I really wanted to address both sides of the coin because I've been that change maker that you're dropped into an organization that it doesn't matter what you do, there's just nothing that's going to happen. So I felt like it was really important to publish those criteria. So if you're thinking about a job, and you're the type of person that likes to make positive change, check in and see if your organization actually has these criteria, so you don't end up just completely languishing in a role.
Oh, I love this. This is very good. Okay. So if you can feel inside of you that you're creative, tenacious about change, love to look around beyond yourself to help others in making change, what do we need to look for then in a workplace?
Yeah. So I'm going to scan over here to my paper and go through, we'll do the organizational stuff, but then we should go back and do some of the
Yeah.
individual things. But for the organizational factors that you need is we took a look at actually, we can kind of do this simultaneously because there were these themes that emerged. And what we did is we mapped those to what would be the organizational behaviors. So a change maker has this insatiable learning. They are just the type of person that, they just always want to learn. Like half of the people that we interviewed had advanced degrees, either a master's or a PhD. And so the organizational correlate is if insatiable learning is what they need, then you need to create the conditions that facilitate that. So do you provide funding for people to take courses? The military allowed me to get a master's degree for free. That was an example of facilitating my change making. Are there certificate programs, conferences, protected time? Is there mentorship? So those are all the things that, when you're looking at a job, like, are they going to support your ability to keep learning?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Okay, good.
So the next one is inspiration and sustainment in change making. So courage and resilience. So change making is tough. It's hard. And every single person we interviewed said some version of, I knew it was going to be tough, but not this tough. So if you're feeling that, that's completely normal. So the organizational action that can support people is coaching, like having a coach to be able to cheer you on and give you resources to be successful, peer support, just culture. You can't make change very effectively at a dysfunctional, toxic environment. So making sure the culture of the place, it doesn't have to be, not everything that happens in an organization has to be perfect, but overall response, when something not great happens, how does the organization respond? And then some other things, sponsorship, and then appropriate staffing. Can people take their leave? I mean, how many times have I talked with doctors or other healthcare professionals and they have paid leave on the books and they're like, but I can't take it. It's really going to put everyone out. That's a red flag if you can't take your vacation time.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that every human needs rest and relaxation. And like that 3 months that you took out of your job was enough time to give you this massive ability to heal and come up with new ideas and inspiration for your next chapter. We can see how stepping away from your workplace is really important.
So key. So yeah, I should have put it in the paper, but I now work for an organization that, after 10 years of full-time work, you earn a sabbatical year. I mean, how amazing is that?
All right, sorry, go back to the after 10 years.
Oh, so the place I work now, after 10 years, you earn a sabbatical year. I mean, wouldn't that be fantastic? And then you think about the actual benefits of the organization that you take a year, you go work somewhere else, you learn something new, or you just rest. The energy that you're going to come back. And again, that's going to like help the organization. And that's an example of an organization taking the big picture and being less transactional. Like, oh, we had to cover that person's salary for a year. But what's the dividend that everybody gets from that year?
Yeah. Talk about what you may or may not know, but things about leadership, the things about the leadership in the organization that would be facilitating towards this organizational culture.
I think the last thing that I just said is I think what healthcare is suffering from so much right now is a focus on transactions, ROI. And, I love this concept of, we can all read a spreadsheet and understand return on investment. There are many things in healthcare that are very hard to measure. And there are many things that an organization does that provide value, and it's hard to compute it on a spreadsheet. So I think that's the challenge for leaders. And what I'm looking for is, can they see the big picture? Can they see how investing in the community, in the people, how it might be hard to have that dollar amount on the spreadsheet, but they can see the bigger picture?
Hmm. Yeah. Even that responsiveness to feedback or desire to hear from their staff. It sounds like these organizations who are good for positive change want to listen, want to hear the ideas, and want to come at it with some resources to make change.
Yeah, that's exactly what emerged from the research. Is people said repeatedly, they would use phrases like, the place I don't work or I work at is not perfect. It's really complicated. It's a big bureaucracy, but overall, I think it's trying to do right. Sometimes it's hard to get the communication right, but at the end of the day, I think my boss or I think the leaders of our organization really do want to hear from us. That was the phrases people said over and over again. Actually, nobody in our group said the opposite.
Yeah, I think to be making change, you need to be in a situation, like you said, that was receptive to the ideas of change and wanting to make positive change and positive culture.
Yeah, I think the framework we used for the study was this idea that all transformative change happens with an internal transformation. So it was really this loop of, I have to be learning and growing, which then influences the team around me, which then upcycles to the organization. So thinking about, we want organizations that are learning, especially right now with things moving so fast. I had a chat with a fellow emergency doctor that works at a different organization than me. And he was like, I brought up AI to my team, and the higher ups just shot it down and was like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And I was just like, mind blown. This was a place that I had worked at previously, and I had heard that there was actually a person making the schedule. There was like, I don't know, 7 or 10 doctors working a day, and they were handwriting the schedule, which I'm just like, that is insane. Like, that is exactly the use case for AI in an algorithm that's going to be more fair, and can run the schedule like 20 different ways, to see what's the best way to take care of your docs. So that's just, to me, another example of like, what? Like, we're not going to consider it? Like, that's nuts.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so they're the sorts of things that's the opposite of what we want to see within an organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, there's a couple more. I think, one that I'd like to hit on is all the change makers recognize that this is emotional work. And I think anybody, if you think about a change that you were trying to make, you're going to have friction. There are going to be people that come into your office and they're like, WTF, like, what are you doing? Or don't you know we did this 5 years ago? And they're going to like dump on you about how upset they are with you or how upset they are with the people that tried to do it before. And so everybody talked about this ability to hold space for people, and that they had to work on themselves. Like, one person actually talked about, like, I mark days on my calendar that people just can't meet with me. I can't work clinical shifts, and they're my mental health days. So they all talked about some type of self-care mechanism so they could keep showing up and doing the work. And so what that looks like for me from an organizational standpoint is emotional, helping people to better manage their emotions. That could be coaching, it could be peer support, it could be access to mental health. But it's also things like 360 evaluations, because getting feedback from your full team, everybody you interact with, is going, if you're a normal, healthy human, going to help you emotionally regulate, because you might be like, oh, wow, I didn't understand that, I was stressing my team out or giving them, deadlines last minute. I didn't think I was. So I think creating conditions like that and systems that are going to support people growing throughout their careers.
Okay. What's the context of that 360? Is that where we're making changes and we want to see how the team's responding to that, or is that just a part of all of us should be considering that within our environments?
I think it's both. I mean, I think so. I worked a lot of jobs, I mean, years at places where I never received any formal feedback. It's just crazy. Worked years in an emergency department. Nobody ever gave me an evaluation. So I think in a perfect world, once a year at least, you would be getting 360 feedback from the techs, the nurses, your fellow colleagues, and your supervisors. And get that into a report that you can review. And then ideally, you would sit down with your supervisor and, go through that and create an action plan for you to keep improving and growing. It's incredible to me, as a resident, I actually did receive that type of feedback. We got feedback from nurses. As an attending, almost never.
So I'm going to push back on that and say, but what if your supervisor's not safe for you? What if that's not the voice that you care to hear, giving you feedback? What if they are part of the problem from you for you personally? Who else could be available to do that feedback with you? So you mentioned coaches, mentors, trusted seniors. Is that when we look at literature about medical education, if you get feedback from a boss that you don't like, you're not going to listen, you're not going to change. So I'm wondering, we do this 360 work in Canada as part of our professional learning under the Health Act. All of the doctors mandatory have to do some reflective work, some personal development work, some work within the standards of practice. And so part of that could be this 360. But they get given it and they don't necessarily have to go and talk to anyone about it. So they can take it and do with it as they please, which is, step one, perhaps. A more mature step would be now go talk to someone about it. But should we be considering who we talk to about it?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think in an ideal world, it would be with a supervisor that, has your best interests in heart. So I think Canada, and then I have some friends that work in Australia, and I think there are some really fantastic practices and that you may be further ahead on this than we are. But I would definitely encourage, I think every physician at some point should go through coaching. And a lot of coaches will offer a 360 process. And you're very much in the driver's seat with that. You get to choose who you want that 360 feedback from. And again, I mean, it's incredibly vulnerable work. And the point that you raise, if you're at a workplace that's not safe, then you shouldn't do that. 100%.
Mm. The next thing I see a lot of where we get feedback in the US picture, at least, is the patient feedback. So we get these, let's say, Press Ganey scores, because I know they're one of them, where the information being given to the physician may be nothing to do with them at all. It could be that this patient was really peeved with the nurse who triaged them or the front desk who checked them in, and the care they received at the time might have been absolutely superb, but the whole 9-hour process of being in the emergency department really ticked them off. There was nothing to do with what the doctor could do differently. So these satisfactions then create more drama for the physician saying, well, what do I do with this information? Because it's not. So part of the 360 in Canada is patient feedback too, which is quite interesting. So it's your colleagues, the staff, and the patients, and you literally have to give out 100 forms and get feedback from so many different sources, and it's this really robust document at the end of it. But I see these places of harm that can happen from
Yeah.
unwanted feedback that's not in context, that just creates frustration because the doctor's not being asked, what do you need? What are you seeing about your job? What is it that you're taking away from this workplace? What is happening for you?
Yeah. And I definitely think physicians have been scapegoated. The system is failing patients and it's failing us. And then we're left holding the bag. I mean, many of us work at places in which your group's reimbursement is tied to Press Ganey scores, and that's incredibly unfair. Um, so, I mean, the patient voice is incredibly important. In an ideal world, we could tease out what was in our control, what was systems
Mm,
issues. We don't work in an ideal world. And I'll give a quick example of a time that was really poor leadership when it came to this type of thing. I was a new attending, and I think we all understand like how vulnerable you are when you
mm,
come out of residency. And I had a patient that had a condition that I was very much considering that they may have this diagnosis. In the place that I worked at, there was a protocol on how you got an MRI. And where I
mm,
worked, for the most part, you had to be admitted to get an MRI.
mhm,
The patient's mother decided to take them to a different hospital, and they were able to get the MRI done in the emergency department, and it confirmed the diagnosis. And so they went on to the social media page for the hospital and they complained about it. So I got called into my chair's office, and he said, "Look at what's on the social media page about your care about that visit." And I explained everything that had happened, and I said, "I just would like to understand what you'd like me to do differently next time, because I followed our hospital protocol." And he just said, "Well, this is a very unfortunate case." And I left that office, and like that is such an example of, I want to swear, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, but I'm just going to say really poor leadership. I mean, like so what had really happened in that situation is he had gotten called into the CEO's office, and got spanked metaphorically. And so what did he do? He called me into his office to do that to me. And a real leader, you know, would have just not even brought that to my attention. I didn't monitor the hospital's Facebook page. There was no learning for me there. There was absolutely none. So, I think what it really comes down to is Josh Hartzell, who was on my thesis committee, wrote this book about caring in healthcare. And what we need more of in this moment is caring. And that interaction was not caring. He had zero interest in my well being, in my professional growth. He just unloaded on me. And that's frankly what's burning doctors out.
mm. Yeah, well, one, the system is burning you out because you know this person needs an MRI and they can't have one in your department because of the rules. And then you have senior leadership saying, well, that's not good enough, but you can't have an MRI. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely nuts. I mean, it's a complete catch 22. And, I think everybody understands, and even our patients to a certain extent understand that the healthcare dysfunction. I mean, a lot of them do. And we have to be caring to each other, despite all the dysfunction that's happening around us. And I think that is, if you could boil everything down from the work we did, and looking at organizational actions, is the question is this caring at the end of the day?
Yeah. And that wasn't caring. And I'm so happy you're doing work in this area and you're starting to think about a program and a department that could bring some of these amazing things that you've learned along the way in.
Yeah, I mean, that's the greatest part, is to now have the tools, the things that I didn't know when I graduated medical school, to have like this greater aperture that, I can, and now I have a leadership role. And that's the other thing is once you get some leadership, this is what absolutely, kills me is, okay, so you've worked so hard and you have this title, you're the medical director, you're the program director, you're the chair. Are you going to use your powers for good or evil? What was the point? What was the point of getting to this point in your career if you're not going to take some risks, if you're not going to have hard conversations, if you're not going to walk into the CEO's office and say, like, you're giving me something impossible here,
Mm.
and I guess at the end of the day, it comes down to integrity. And, I talk about in my book, I have actually never worked at a hospital that has the Hippocratic Oath displayed. And I find that so odd. You go to medical school in the US, we do the white coat ceremony. They have a modern version of the Hippocratic Oath that we read or listen to, and then you never see it. And what happens if more of us looked at that every day and we started saying, hey, you know what? This isn't in line with our professional creed. Like, this actually violates my professional values. Healthcare is actually different. We're not making hamburgers. Making hamburgers is a very valuable and important thing, but that's not what we're doing here. We're dealing with people's lives. And I know that comes from a place of privilege, that I can say that. And at this point, I've accumulated enough financial stability and paid off student loans that when I feel an organization isn't living up to that, and isn't willing to change and doesn't have the conditions for change, I leave.
Mm. Yeah. And you're talking about the silence, the not having a voice within the organization. The listeners will have heard the podcast last week around this with junior doctors and their silence. And the heartbreak of this continues in the culture of medicine from an Australian perspective, majority, but you're saying the same thing, that I'm now in a position where I can leave if I'm not having a voice. If the organization is not looking after me and or not looking after patients, and I can't change the system knowing that I really want to, but if they are not letting me have a voice, I can walk with my feet. But many of our colleagues and many of our junior doctors can't walk with their feet.
Yeah.
They have got that financial requirement to have a job.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really tough. And I think there are pockets of really positive change happening. And I think, the call to action for people is, this is too much for you to carry on your own. You cannot completely transform an organization or change a law or improve healthcare funding on your own. And so the only way that happens is through collective agency. So anytime you're starting to feel like you need to pull your hair out, that's the time where you start to say, where's my people? Where are the like-minded people that are also struggling with this? And how can we use our collective voice? How can if you're a resident, and there's a resident committee there's always a committee that speaks to the hospital leadership. Maybe that's a national organization that can be your mouthpiece. In the United States, we have EMRA, which is the Emergency Medicine Resident Association. So again, it's that type of change. It takes longer, and it requires different skill sets once we have to start reaching out and networking and collaborating. But for these really thorny problems that we're dealing with, it's the collective agency that's going to make the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I love that you mentioned some agencies that can be helpful for this voice creation, because I think that's really important. All the things you've talked about is about how do we help these change agents really be able to step up and do what they would love to do within an organization, is to start with having that agency of voice to say to the organization, pull your socks up, you're not doing well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also the most important thing for physicians and all humans is you have to live. So if you're ever in a condition that is completely untenable, there's always a pause button. And clearly, we know the statistics on physician suicide, student suicide, or medical students or residents. So knowing that there's always a pause button. I'm an ambassador for the Lorna Breen Foundation. Are you familiar with Lorna's
Yeah.
story? Yeah. So Lorna, unfortunately, died by suicide because she was afraid that if she took time off to take care of herself, that she wouldn't be able to be a doctor anymore. And that was despite living in a state. She lived in New York that actually had in their credentialing that they couldn't ask about mental health things that didn't impact your ability to work. Um, again, I think the more this conversation, the conversations we're having about it, and Lorna Breen Foundation is another fantastic organization for people to check out.
Yeah. Thank you. Tell us about your book, Revitalized. Tell us where that came from and what is in there.
So before I wanted to be a doctor, I actually wanted to be a writer. It truly was my first love. In first grade, I won a writing competition, and it's hard to pinpoint where I decided that I didn't want to be a writer anymore. I lived in a really small town, and I think you looked around at what jobs people had, and I never met anybody that was a writer. So it just didn't seem possible. But I always wrote along the way. It was just always something that was part of me. And I had kind of on my life goal that I was going to write a book. And there's lots of different things I want to write about. But during this time, I felt acutely how what a dangerous situation we're in medicine, how many doctors were losing to suicide, how terrible the workforce numbers are. Emergency medicine, 60% of people are burned out. The house of medicine, 50%. So I kept talking to doctors, and I would share things that I was learning through coaching or therapy. And almost universally, people would say, I've never heard that before. I've never read that before. And I mean, a lot of the things that I talk about, people that are reading psychology, that type of stuff, they'll be familiar with Brene Brown and some of the other thought leaders that I mentioned in the book, but doctors weren't. So I just decided I was going to collate all the things I had learned. And I wanted to have a book that anytime I encounter a doctor that's struggling or curious, that I could hand them and say, here it is. Here's all the references. Here's the end of each chapter. There's some prompts for you to, put this into your own context. So it's part memoir, and then it's really written to be a guidebook to really crafting the career that you want and that you deserve. I mean, you think about how long people go to medical school and the fact that you spend so much money and so much time, and then you might at the end of it regret doing it. It's just completely unacceptable to me. So I hope the readers of the book, by the time they finish it, are able to craft their next revitalization to be more fulfilled at work.
Oh, I love that. That sounds really fascinating and probably good for doing. Could you do that as a group? Like if you had a group of people doing it as a book club?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's my favorite thing to do, is to visit a group of doctors and do a book club. So it's great to do as a book club, and it's a great book that you can just keep coming back to, and it's totally written to write in the margins and write all over it.
There we go. Okay. All you out there who are very interested in doing some more of this work, now you got somewhere to go. Thank you, Andrea, for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. We've gone up and down and up again. Lots of variations of things that you've learned along the way. How do people find you if they're interested in learning more?
My website is andreaustinmd.com, and my social media handle is at Andrea Austin MD. I'm most active on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I also have a podcast. It's called Heartline. So that's another place people can find me.
Perfect. Great. And anything we didn't talk about that we should talk about before we end?
I think one of the most impactful things that I learned along the way is that the physician burnout numbers are very similar in different countries. So one of the stories I used to tell myself is that if I moved to Canada or Australia, that I wouldn't be burned out anymore. And so being part of the Recalibrate coaching group with doctors from Australia and New Zealand and hearing the same type of issues that I was experiencing in the United States and the learning that the burnout numbers were actually quite similar was, I mean, incredibly sad and disappointing, but then incredibly healing because it began to open up space that I couldn't like live in. I mean, I could live in a fantasy world that I just moved to Australia and like my life was going to be amazing. But much like, somebody that job hops and switches jobs and you don't do any internal work, like it's not going to be different. If you're the same version, the story that it's the system, it is the system. And, Brene Brown talks about the paradox. So the paradox is it is the system and you can do internal work and have agency and relate to the system differently.
Okay, that's valuable. I like that. And so fascinating and true.
Yeah, this has been great, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for being here. I think our listeners will get a lot out of this. So many different opportunities for recognizing what's happening in your system, what's happening inside you, what are some other things we could think about doing, and all the very best to you with this new program development. I'm really excited for your future graduates to have had a different experience with clinical medicine.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, if you found this podcast episode helpful, I would encourage you to like and subscribe. Every time you do, you help a colleague or friend find our podcast and it can help them too. Don't forget to share it along with your friends. If you're looking for extra help, don't forget we have Charting Champions for physicians and Smarter Charting for nurse practitioners and other clinicians to help you get home with your work done. We are helping you create sustainable clinical medicine. Thanks for listening.